That might be good. Alrighty, amazing. Well, welcome to tonight's Heaven Hill virtual tasting. We've been taking a variation of this tasting around the East Coast with Scott hosting some in-person events, but obviously we couldn't possibly deprive people who couldn't make it to those nights. So we put together a virtual tasting. This is my very not so often chance to be a bit patriotic. For those who don't know, I'm technically an American citizen, but Scott is far more researched and experienced in American whiskies than I am. So I borrowed some of his incredible research notes for tonight. And we got some real cool, fun, interactive, I suppose, videos and stuff to watch later as well. But massive shout out to Scott as a thank you for sharing those with me. He would have joined us tonight, but he's busy. So it's just me and Ollie, the usual suspects. Before I get started, usual housekeeping to go over. We recommend having 6 glasses so you can go back and compare, particularly with the Elijah Craigs. That would be like a really cool comparison. If you have glassware for it, if not, don't worry. As usual, please don't drive after the tasting. Responsible drinking is always encouraged. All of them are recorded as well, as Ollie said, with hitting record before I start the chitty chat. For anyone who wants to watch them back or who's unable to join us tonight, they're on our YouTube channel. As the kids say, like and subscribe and all that shenaniganry. But for anyone who wants to read a breakdown as well of these brands and of Heaven Hill's history and the differences between them, the brands, we've got 2 articles up on the website that break those down. You can find them in the featured brands section. And I think that's about it from me. So we might as well get into the whiskeys. Before we get into like the stories about the whiskeys, one thing that I think is like really interesting to note about American whiskeys is that their background is intrinsically tied to people. Like, when we think of Macallan, you think of, oh, people who've phased in and out, but like never the guy who founded it or whatnot. Not a lot of people recall the name of the guy who founded Dalmore, unless you're a massive Dalmore fan, which fair enough. But in American whiskey, like things really revolve around owners, founders, operators, and stuff like that, which is really cool. So like when researching the Heaven Hill story, a lot of it comes from the Shapiro brothers. Similar with brands like Buffalo Trace as well, where you have to really talk about George T. Stagg to talk about Buffalo Trace. But for Heaven Hill, we have to talk about the Shapiro brothers. So we'll start out with the Heaven Hill bottled in bond. The idea for Heaven Hill Distillery was born in 1934, just after Prohibition ended. 2 brothers, Ed and Max Shapiro, they were Lithuanian immigrants who'd settled in Kentucky, and they became affluent businessmen along with their brothers, 5 Shapiro men in total. Obviously, living in Kentucky, they became associated and acquainted with the Beams. So Joseph or Joe Beam. I will say, if you ever look into the history of the Beam family on their own, it is the most confusing thing ever because there's like 20 of them who all worked in the whiskey industry, and half of them have bizarre names. One's Park, one's Parker. Can't confuse them. They're 2 different generations. You got Earl, Joe, Jim, Joseph. It's a whole litany of headaches. So I highly recommend try not to think about Beams for too long. I nearly drove myself crazy trying to figure out who was the father and who was the son. But essentially, Joseph Beam and his son Harry Beam, together with like a couple of investors, set about founding the distillery in 1935. They initially applied for the name Heaven Hill as one word. They wanted to name it after the former owner of the land, a farmer named William Heaven Hill. But then the license came back to them with the distillery name separated into 2 words, Heaven and Hill. And they were like, oh, can we request a change to fix this? It was a mistake. You guys made a mistake. And they're like, oh, okay, all right. Sweet. That'll be $25 for a refiling fee. And $25 back then was like a lot of money today for paperwork. I think I'm very bad at inflation, but I think it'd be almost $1,000 just to refile because they messed up. So yeah, not really worth it. They're like, no. That's all good. We'll just stick with the two separate words.
What year was that, Emma?
It would have been 1935, or probably 1934, 1935, one of the two. They would have applied for it before they set up the name. Ollie's doing the calculations now. um, but yeah, so they brought on board Joseph and his son Harry Beam as master distillers. Obviously, a massive legacy. Joseph was a cousin of Jim Beam, but the Beams hit financial strife, and they had to sell their portion of ownership. So Max and Ed brought in the other Shapiro brothers as co-owners to cover their portion of the ownership, and they ended up deciding to buy out every other investor and make it a fully family-owned operation. There wasn't any hard blood between the Shapiros and the Beams, though, and so after Joseph and Harry left, they hired Earl Beam, who was the nephew of Jim Beam, as their next master distiller. Scott looked into it, and of the 7 master distillers that have been at Heaven Hill, 4 of them have been Beams. So pretty good legacy between the two families. So this specific whiskey, the Heaven Hill bottled in bond, the first expression was one of the earliest whiskeys ever released from the distillery. They released it in 1939 as a 4-year-old, but obviously as stocks matured, they shifted to a higher age statement. So I'm super curious to see what you guys think of this. I know that like American whiskey tends to get, I don't know. Obviously, if you're like really big into Scotch, you're like, oh yeah, kind of sideline American. But I really am curious, particularly if you're a Scotch drinker, what you think of these whiskeys.
Because we're a bit of an intimate group tonight, so feel free to unmute yourself as well if you want to ask a question rather than type it out. We're all friends here.
100%. Yes,
I
I
was
would
gonna
love wet questions as well, and tasting notes, anything at all.
I was gonna ask, are we all familiar with the bottled and bond rules and regulations? It's probably the one of the most strict or stricter parts of the bourbon industry. Hands up if anyone doesn't know what it is.
Yeah, I understand what it is. Yeah. And
All right.
on that first one, it smells like salted caramel popcorn or ice cream or something.
Mm. Yeah, it's got this almost toffee apple thing, like when you get a really like tart Granny Smith with like toffee caramel on it. Mm.
So Emma, my understanding of the bottled and bond is it needs to be 4 years, at least 4 years, bottled precisely at 100 proof, so 50 ABV, made by one distiller at a single distillery and aged in a particular season in a single bonded warehouse.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know necessarily if the age comes into play. I'll have to look into it more.
I'm pretty sure that's the first part of it. It's just the 100 proof, 4 years minimum. Yeah, single season, single distillery in a bonded warehouse. I think that was.
Yeah, like the main key is one distiller, one season, bonded warehouse. Those are kind of the 3 main ones. Because of the way that bonded warehouses work in America and stuff like that, there's like a lot of governmental oversight. And we'll kind of touch on a little bit of that later, actually, on the next whiskey, because that's a pretty funny story. But yeah, I don't know if it's kind of a thing of like, because obviously with straight whiskey, as long as a whiskey is over 2 years old, I believe it can be called straight whiskey. And then if you want to call it straight and it's over 4 years old, you have to put the age on the label. it does get very confusing because some people say this, some people say that. I mean, technically, there is no minimum maturation age for whiskey in America. A journalist friend of mine went to Jim Beam, and they said I could fill a barrel, roll it from one end of the warehouse to the other, decant it and call it bourbon, but that would be a waste of a barrel. So there actually isn't a minimum age statement required for American whiskey, but straight is a indicator of this has had age on it. This is, legit or whatever it happens to be. However, they choose to kind of convey it. But if it is over 4 years of age, they do say like you have to put the age on it, which is why you find 5-year-old, 7-year-old, whatever it happens to be, put on a label for the most part in American whiskey. What do we think? How are you feeling? I haven't exactly eased us in with a 50%. Quite, particularly not particularly soft. Could have gone with the second one first as a wheated bourbon, but maybe not. Who knows? Thoughts? Are we enjoying?
The first time I tried this whiskey, I was a bit impartial to it, but I've had it a few times now, and each time I go back to it, it's getting better. I don't know how to explain it. It's just really sweet on the palate now. Really nice dream.
Kind of reminds me a little bit of Jim Beam, to be honest. Sweetness on the palate.
Yep. Yeah, well, I think it would have been, Harry Beam would have come up with the recipe for this, and they probably would not have adjusted it too much beyond that. And in the early days, they're working off the same or a slightly adjusted recipe to Jim Beam. So that could be it for me. I always get American whiskeys fall into 2 flavor categories: marshmallows or pickles. So like they have marshmallow sweetness, or they've got like a dill pickle savoriness to them. So for me, this is more of a pickle whiskey.
I'd agree with them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's for me, it's just the easiest way to classify them. And I'm a massive sweet tooth, so I'm like, I look for marshmallow whiskeys. But you just know that this would make a really good pickleback. Are you guys aware of what a pickleback is?
Sounds something
Okay.
uniquely American.
It is very uniquely American, but it's also a uniquely bartender thing. It's the most horrific thing you've ever tasted in your life. It's a shot of whiskey followed up with a shot of pickle juice, just straight pickle juice. I don't know why. It just seems like self-sabotage, but I'm sure Ollie would love it. But I'm not a pickle person, so I never partook. But it's a very classically like American whiskey bartender thing. Sometimes you'll find bars that do it with like Jamesons, but yeah, you can do it with any whiskey, but American whiskey is traditional. If you're really into pickles, go order a pickleback shot next time you're out. We'll rock your world, probably not in the best way. But yeah. All right. Might move on to the second one. So giving you like a little bit of a taster of the Heaven Hill history. And we kind of can't really talk too much about Old Fitzgerald without talking more about how Old Bernheim Distillery came into the picture. So if anyone here is familiar with the American Midwest, you'll know that it's not exactly a forgiving place weather-wise. Hurricanes, tornadoes, like crazy thunderstorms. That area we call the Bible Belt is not particularly well known for being tepid, sunny, perfect temperature all year round. It's not California, let's just say, which has its own geological issues. But in November 1996, there was a really horrific thunderstorm that swept across Kentucky. And in some parts, it hit up to 70-mile-an-hour winds. Absolutely insane. And one of the rick houses at the old Heaven Hill, the original Heaven Hill distillery, was struck by lightning. They figured out many years later it was struck by lightning, which set all of the whiskey inside alight and ablaze, and it burnt down the building in under 15 minutes. So if you've never seen a rick house, they're massive, typically 7-story structures, and every square inch of it is filled with barrels full of whiskey. So obviously all the alcohol inside the barrels really helped the fire. And because of the winds, it jumped from rick house to rick house. So 6 additional burnt to the ground. So 7 rick houses were totally gone in total, all burnt to the ground. And it actually jumped onto the main distillery building itself as well. So the main distillery and distilling site was totally destroyed and burnt from the inside out. I think Ollie and I've got a video of some of the fire ongoing. If you wanted to share that, Ollie.
You want it on now?
If you can, that would be great.
Sure.
Yeah, I found this old video on YouTube. We'll link it through in the full wrap-up email so you can watch the full thing, because we can't get sound on it for some reason. But yeah, they did a look back at one of the history's worst distillery fires, and it was the Heaven Hill distillery. Thankfully, nobody was injured, nobody was hurt, none of the firefighters were hurt, but it was like absolutely insane. The news called it a flaming river of bourbon, because the wind had just picked it up, and then you had the liquid gushing out. And yeah, so they ended up having to all the employees evacuated. A lot of the firefighters had to just dump their stuff and run, and then the rainstorms came and the wind came and the reporters were trying to report on it, and it was just atrocious. And the whiskey and the warehouses were still smoldering the next morning. So it was absolutely insane and devastating. Amazingly, the Shapiro family soldiered on, and nobody lost their jobs, in spite of the fact that there wasn't really a distillery left to distill at. They ended up going to work for other distilleries in the area. The Shapiros helped get them positions at other distilleries in the area until they could rebuild or buy a new property, which is what they did. They still had 37 rick houses that were still standing, so they could continue bottling, but they just couldn't make any more bourbon. But conveniently, United Distillers had been wanting to move on their old Bernheim distillery around the same time. So it was a perfect opportunity. The Shapiros snapped it up, and what came with it was the Kentucky distillery number DSPKY 1. So it was the first distillery registered after Prohibition, which is why Heaven Hill Distillery, they have the DSPKY, but they renamed it, which is why they have distillery number 1, despite the fact that they're not the oldest. So with the purchase of that came a whole bunch of brands as well, including the old Fitzgerald brand. So the brand had been around since the 1890s, mostly thanks to a made-up story. A man named Solomon Herbst realized that his Prussian roots and surname weren't really conducive to selling bourbon. So he fabricated the story of this man, Johnny Fitzgerald, who was this Irish master distiller who crafted incredible bourbon and sold it to cruise ship liners, and then decided to move to Indiana and make whiskey there. But he left him with this distillery, right? But the actual John E. Fitzgerald was a US Treasury agent. And that's how this brand got its name, properly got its name. So John Fitzgerald was a US Treasury agent who obtained a former co-worker's key to the Stitzel-Weller Distillery bond store. So Treasury bond store government officers, everyone had one key, so you couldn't access it on your own. You had to have the second key to be able to open the bond store. And so he bought a second key off of a former staffer. which gave him unfettered access to the Stitzelweller distillery bond store. He had a penchant for the barrels on the 5th floor of the warehouse, and there were stories of them finding him behind barrels, sometimes passed out, and a lot of barrels that were suddenly lighter. So they were affectionately known as Fitzgerald barrels because they couldn't do anything to stop him from getting in. He was the treasury agent. So yeah, the barrels that were suspiciously missing liquid were called Fitzgerald barrels. So as a tongue-in-cheek reference, the old Fitzgerald name brand was born, and referred to barrels released from the 5th floor of the warehouse. The original style of Old Fitzgerald was much more rye heavy, but Pappy Van Winkle took it over and they made it, they changed the recipe to become more wheated, as is their style. That is what they do. They do a much more heavily wheated bourbon. So yeah, this will be obviously very different to the first one. Now I'm gonna have some for me because I've been talking. That's why I like to have guests, because then they can do the talking while I do the drinking.
Whilst Emma's pouring a sample, that fire apparently like 10% of the world's bourbon went up in 20.
Yeah. So the loss of 90,000 barrels in those 7 warehouses, and it was 2% of the world's bourbon at the time.
In 24 hours, just gone up. And the other tidbit that Scott shared in one of the in-person tastings was they designed all the rick houses to be easily rolled downhill. So once you had your barrel and you're ready to decant it, you could just roll it downhill to the distillery at the bottom to decant it and do your bottling. And that's why the River of Fire started at one of the top warehouses and just basically rolled down the hill, and could not be stopped. So
yeah. Yeah, it's just like, what was convenient at the time for filling was not convenient when there was an emergency. But yeah, super devastating story. I mean, it's not the only distillery accident that's happened. They do happen occasionally. I will say Heaven Hill Distillery does now have state-of-the-art fire fireproofing and fire plans in place, but it actually changed. All the distilleries had to update their safety and everything like that. I know another distillery, Barton Distillery, had a rick house completely collapse on them because of ground erosion. Thankfully, no fire, just a lot of sad liquid on the ground. There's also a video of that falling apart. So you see like one wall just slump and collapse, and then all the barrels come tumbling out. Don't watch it if you're traumatized by the idea of watching a lot of whiskey go to waste. But yeah. I'm curious to see what you guys think of this one. Do you notice the distinct difference in the mash bill, like the much more heavily wheated aspect of it?
Initially, I got like green apples on the nose and on the taste, then a little bit of peppermint or something.
Yeah, definitely like maybe like a dried old like peppermint leaf kind of. I almost get like a parchment kind of thing to it as well, like a reedy kind of parchment thing.
Feels like an oily and mouthfeel to it.
It definitely sticks. It clings to the tongue.
Not in a bad way, but definitely more than the first.
Yeah. Yeah, so they do a so this is a 15-year-old. They do a 17-year-old expression as well, which is even harder to get your hands on.
it's on tomorrow night's rare tasting if anyone's doing both.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's tomorrow night. Yeah, no, it's apparently spectacular. I had someone who was like, is there any more bottles coming? And I asked Chris and he was like, no, I wish. Like, that's fair enough. Yeah, it's one of those things that's so hard to get good American with, like, not good, but like so hard to get cool American whiskey in America, even harder over here. So yeah, it's really interesting. I will say, having worked in a bar that served American whiskey, the number one people who ordered American whiskey at Whiskey and Elmet were Americans. I was like, you can get this at home. They're like, I know, but I want to drink it here. And I'm like, why? What is the purpose? Try something you've never had before.
Was Chris actually getting those from the distillery, or is it through somewhere else?
Oh,
No, this official import. So as part of the Heaven Hill bottled and bond that we promoted earlier in the month in April, and the Elijah Craig barrel cask C922, which is the last one tonight, we got access to the full range, including the 15 and the 17-year-old. So all that was available. We got most of Australia's allocation. We shared a big chunk of it to bars across Australia. So a dozen bars got some of our bottles. We basically got, the brand has, Heaven Hill has not done anything in Australia for a very long time. And they came to us and go, hey, you've got the whiskey drinkers. Can we do some events with you? Can we do the virtual tasting like tonight? Can we do some tastings in each of the main sort of capital cities? And they asked us to put together a bit of a marketing plan to help relaunch the brand in Australia. So that's all the activity you've been seeing has been around it. And in response to that, we also got the bigger chunk of the 15 and the 17-year-old. So yeah, a few of the bars have it. We did a bit of a blind secretly with a couple pappies as well, with both the 15 and the 17-year-old. A lot of people prefer the old Fitz, both the 15 and the 17, especially to, pappy, 15 and 20-year-old, even the 25, and people couldn't tell the difference. Like the 17 old Fitz, more people rated it over some of the pappies. So that just tells you, don't pay crazy market prices for the most hyped up bottles. If you can find this one at this is under $1,000 versus the others at $2,000 to $3,000. It's still, there's value to be found out there if you're looking for it.
Yeah, the OFs are the best value we did on the market, I reckon, for what you get. That 19 is phenomenal.
Mm.
And then the 19 wasn't brought in officially into Australia. I know a few people got it from the distillery over there and brought it over. So if you've been lucky to try it, again, another great whiskey.
Yeah, it's so like American whiskey is so much more accessible in terms of like price point, I think. But yeah, that's the thing is, yes, they're all different recipes, but the value for money can be found in everywhere. I mean, some of my favorite American whiskeys are at the lower end. Don't get me wrong, that Pappy 12-year-old, or what is it, the Van Winkle 12-year-old Lot B, I think about that every day, but but my bank account can't think about it. So instead I drink other marshmallow whiskeys. But yeah, it's one of those, there's so many cool whiskeys in America as well that we never even see or get our hands on. Despite the fact that Australia is the biggest consumer of bourbon in the world, because we consume it in RTD cans. So they are like, oh, clearly we can send them anything that's not fancy because they'll drink it. And the problem is, it's like, we need to encourage them to send us more cool shit because we will drink it. We just need, just please ignore the people drinking Woodstock RTDs up in the sticks. So yeah.
I will add,
yeah.
as before you jump into the next whiskey, so the Heaven Hill team have been so impressed with Australia's demand for some of these rarer bottlings. Because what was meant to last the rest of the year is gone in less than 3 weeks. So they might just mute you, James. Sorry, there we go. Some blending or something going on in the background there. So yeah, but we Australians bought the rest of the year's allocation of all these amazing Heaven Hills in 3 to 4 weeks versus 9-8 months. So they're busy working in the background to figure out how do we get more these old Fitz and stuff to Australia, hopefully this year as well.
Yeah, 100%. Well, we'll move on to the Elijah
Sorry,
Craig.
can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
See, a lot of some of the American whiskies do like charcoal filtering and everything like that. Does Heaven Hill do anything along that lines? No.
No, so that process is called the Lincoln County process. It's common in Tennessee, but not like Jack Daniels does it. But in Kentucky, they don't. Because you can't call it bourbon in the same way, which is like technically Jack Daniels is not a bourbon. It will say Tennessee whiskey. It'll say sour mash Tennessee whiskey. It won't say bourbon. It is a bourbon, but because they filtered it through that process, they can't legally call it bourbon for the most part. So if it says bourbon on it, it will not have been filtered. It won't have undergone that process. Yeah, it's a bit weird because America won't allow any additives or colorants or anything like that. So when Jack Daniels kind of came about with artificial sweetening sounds terrible, but it's kind of at the core chemically what they're trying to do by filtering their whiskey through maple wood charcoal. The sugars in the maple wood are carrying through, but like technically you're not adding maple wood or maple syrup or anything like that to it. It's just residual sugars from the charcoal and whatnot that are coming through. So yeah, they're a little bit stickler about that. The bourbon laws are very like controlled in that way. But yeah, they would do like a light charcoal filtering, same as you would in Scotland, just to get or a light, not charcoal, but a light filtering to get bits out, like barrel bits out. But beyond that, there wouldn't be any filtration involved, like charcoal or anything like that for Kentucky bourbons for the most part. But yeah, if you see something that says like sour mash whiskey or Tennessee like sour mash whiskey or Tennessee whiskey, you're like, it's probably been filtered, which is not a bad thing. Like it's totally fine. It tends to make it sweeter, but you know, it's just at the end of the day, it's all preference. I mean, I love port and sherry cask finished bourbons. They're technically not legally bourbon, which is why all the Americans are very tricky with law, right? Which is why on a bottle of Angel's Envy, you'll see Angel's Envy Kentucky straight bourbon finished in port casks. They're not telling you it's a straight bourbon. They're saying it's a bourbon finished in port casks. So it's like a small little loophole that a lot of them use to get around the like the casking rules and stuff like that. And it's kind of the same thing with like, you know, it's twisting words around to make it suit their purpose.
It's like teaspooning a scotch.
Yeah, kind of. Like, no, actually. So there's a really good frame of reference in Scotland from Glenmurray Distillery. So you cannot use cider casks in whiskey production, even though they taste phenomenal. But Glenmurray matured their whiskey in a virgin oak barrel. They then sent that barrel, once it had been decanted, to a cider house to mature cider in. And then when they got that barrel back, they were like, well, technically, it's a whiskey barrel. It's not a cider barrel because it was ours first and we used it to mature whiskey. We just let them borrow it. They were only allowed to do it as a distiller exclusive release, but legally you could not call that Scotch whiskey. But because it was a Scotch, like a Scotch cask that finished cider and then refinished Scotch, they got through a loophole in that. So it's kind of more like that. It's doing a little dance with the law to make sure that they can still put the name on it. But yeah, essentially, Angel's Envy couldn't say, oh, you know, this is our bourbon. Technically, this is our bourbon whiskey. No, this is our bourbon finished in port whiskey. So that's how you see the wording on all of their marketing and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a bit tricky. But I mean, like it's definitely super good though. So yeah, all right. Elijah Craig, 18-year-old. So going back to people and also myths, Americans love a good fake story, as we can see from the political sphere, but we won't talk about that too much. but Americans love like a larger than life story, this like mythological, person. So Elijah Craig is the brand is an homage to Reverend Elijah Craig, a man who is considered by many the father and inventor of bourbon, which is a myth that's perpetually, gone across Kentucky, swept like wildfire. But it's not correct. Whiskey writer Fred Minnick actually met a bartender in Kentucky who said she was proud to be a descendant of the man who invented bourbon, and he apparently had to gently correct her, which absolutely devastated her because she told everyone, my ancestor was Reverend Elijah Craig, and he was just like, he wasn't out at first. So the man originally led a traveling church who eventually settled in Kentucky. They bought 1,000 acres of land in what would later become Bourbon County. Where does a preacher get the money for 1,000 acres of land? Well, he was particularly entrepreneurial. When they settled down in Kentucky, they founded a cloth mill, a paper mill, a rope mill, a lumber mill, and a grist mill. So he had so many businesses. He was supplying pretty much anything and everything you could possibly need to the town. And then he decided, well, I've got a grist mill. He's like, I should set about making whiskey. So he opened his distillery in 1789. And the story goes that one of his barrel barns, his warehouses, that was holding empty barrels that had not been filled yet, burnt down. And it left some of the casks charred only on the inside, but not the outside. And because he was frugal, he decided to use them for transporting his whiskey anyway. Obviously, it's very convenient, and statistically and physically, like the pure mechanics of it, very unlikely that only the inside of the barrels were burnt and the outside was miraculously in perfect condition. Plus the idea that they would still hold liquid without leaking after being in a blaze that was long and hot enough to burn down his warehouse, but somehow didn't burn down all the barrels made of wood in the warehouse. So yeah, it's a very unlikely story, but it's one that they liked to tell. But he was just most likely one of the many early distillers of the period. He was just obviously better known. He'd been traveling, he had a name, he had the backing of being a reverend and a lot of that kind of status, as well as being a businessman. But historical evidence suggests as well that the African Americans that he had as slaves were doing the majority of the distilling work, as was very common in the early days. So it's very likely that, kind of similar how Nearest Green was to Jack Daniels, Reverend Craig had been given the credit for the skills of his workers. So it's one of those stories that the brand and the company tells, and they're very open about the fact that, like, this was the early 1800s. There was a lot of like not okay approaches to how people should be treated. And so, yeah, they very much are really passionate now about looking into the history of some of the people who worked at the original distillery site. But yeah, Heaven Hill decided to create a brand that was small batch, smaller release, with a high age statement, that was kind of like a little bit of a nod to the father of bourbon, who is not the father of bourbon. He was just the name everyone slapped on the historical books. So yeah, but I'm curious to see what you guys think. Is anyone, I feel like Elijah Craig's probably one of the most familiar American whiskey brands here in Australia that's like not bargain basement stuff. If that makes sense.
That's not Jack or Jim. I have a gripe with this whiskey. This is an amazing whiskey. It's 18 years old. It's great price. It's a cool little funky bottle. It's only 45%. ABV. Imagine if it was like 50 or 55 or something. I don't know. For me, I think I need that little extra kick. Otherwise, it falls a little bit flat for me. It would be perfect otherwise. That's my little gripe.
Yeah, I reckon. Look, I reckon a 48% could be like that little touch of viscosity. It's
It's probably missing that little bit of
oomph.
viscosity, mouthfeel, and something like that.
Yeah.
It just feels watered down to me.
I mean, you could quaff that all day. It's not exactly hard to drink.
Wouldn't turn your nose up at it.
No.
No, if you gave me a bottle, I'd drink it, but it doesn't stand up to the 7 years bottle and bond from Heaven Hill.
Yeah. Got a great story actually. Speaking of if you gave it, there's a company that supplies bars and stuff down here in Melbourne, and they supply a lot of bars all across Australia. And they were changing over their systems and updating their systems, and there were a few errors in price listing for a day or two, right? And a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, she's a massive American whiskey fan, and she noticed that the Elijah Craig 18-year-old was priced at $0. So she ordered some for her bar, and it arrived, and the invoice said $0. So she got I think she ended up with like 2 free bottles of Elijah Craig 18-year-old, and then they sent her an email being like, "Oh, sorry, there was an error with our website. Did they end up getting sent out to you?" She's like, no, they never made it here. They must have caught it in the warehouse. I was like, touche. So that was the first time I ever tried Elijah Craig 18-year-old, was this bottle that she pilfered from the company. And I was like, I mean, to be fair, they're not the best. So
If you are going to compare 2 samples, compare the 18 with the barrel proof later on, because the barrel proof 62.4%. So you can do that ABV comparison. I think it's quite cool.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, well, we might move to the rye now, and then we can get onto the Pikesville, and then I'll get us to the barrel proof sooner. But yeah, I definitely think that like the 18-year-old versus the barrel proof will be a really like interesting comparison. I only have 1 glass, so I can't compare the two, but I will look forward to
Problem is
seeing.
that, as you said, Ollie, that's a $300 bottle at 45%. That's sure it's 18, but then what are you comparing it against to actually justify that, right?
Yeah. It's just with maybe 5 years ago when we didn't have as many cool, unique bourbon brands, but Australia, like we've seen a huge explosion in the last 18 months. And I think for us, I prefer the higher ABV. I want to make the choice do I drink it neat, put some ice in it, water it down. The closer to that cask strength as possible for me, just been part of my journey, at least with drinking whiskey. It's a great whiskey. I agree with you. I just don't like the ABV.
Yeah. And I think as well, like when we think about American whiskeys, some of the very early, I should have brought it if I could find it. Some of the really early American whiskeys were designed for cocktails. And I feel like a lot of the time, an old fashioned always tastes better with a higher strength whiskey, because you're going to get more of that like flavor for longer. It's not going to be watery quite soon after. Obviously 2 shots of whiskey, still having a fun time. But like for me, I love a mint julep, and there's like nothing better than a cask strength bourbon in a mint julep, because then it can just really hold up to all the liquid and the ice and the sugar and everything like that. So yeah, it's I think I understand having lower ABV accessible for like whiskey and cola drinkers, but I also feel like cask strength should be much more sought after. That would be great to see if we could, Ollie, if we could get them to do a cask strength bottling of Elijah Craig 18.
But the rye is 47%, and that's their core range entry level. So I'm confused how they came to that conclusion, but it is what it is.
Might also be where the barrels are matured in the warehouse. It might actually drop ABV. It might not. I'm not sure. obviously America's climate, the Midwest climate, is a lot more similar to Australia, except they get snow in winter more frequently. But yeah, I'm sure there are still American whiskeys that are dropping in ABV rather than increasing, so you never know.
Onto the rye.
Onto the rye. Yeah. So this is like technically the latest addition to the Elijah Craig core releases. Similarly made small batch process, so like much smaller composition of barrels going into it, smaller production capacity throughout the year. Heaven Hill Distillery used to not produce a lot of rye in general, but when they added Rittenhouse and Pikesville brands to their production, they saw fit to add a rye expression to the Elijah Craig family later down the line. So they added this in 2020. It's the first rye ever produced under the Elijah Craig brand. It's not a style that was ever produced, well, that we know of historically, ever produced by Reverend Elijah Craig, despite the fact that rye was a fairly popular grain type in the early days of like pre-prohibition, when a lot of the early Quakers and early immigrants to America came. They were much more familiar with rye grains than corn, or even like they were more familiar with rye and wheat a little bit. It wasn't until there was a lot more information shared from Native American Indians about corn and how to use it, how to treat it, how to grow it, all that, that they started to see that it offered a higher yield. So this is why most whiskeys out of America are bourbon. Corn gives you more alcohol at the end product at the end of the day. Better yield, cheaper, and all that. Rye is really hard to distill, particularly 100% rye. They tend to go like clag in a still. They're a massive pain in the butt. If you've ever spoken to Lee or Brie Atwood from Backwoods Distillery, Lee calls rye whiskey a labor of love. You really have to be prepared mentally and physically to craft 100% rye whiskey, which is why a lot of ryes do tend to be 95% rye and then 5% corn or wheat or whatever it happens to be. That can really kickstart the fermentation and get you a better yield. It's like adding a catalyst, essentially. That can get you a better yield out of the rye. So what you'll see more often is rye whiskeys that are 95% rye and 5% something else. 100% ryes are really tricky. So this is not a 100% rye. I do believe that there is still a good component of corn in this one. And it's not a super massive change in mash bill from the core Elijah Craig. It is just more heavily rye component. But yeah, so curious to see how you feel about that, because for me, I don't have a preference for older age statement American whiskeys. For me, I would drink that rye over the 18-year-old. I'm curious to see if anyone else would.
No, agreed. I'd take the rye over the 18. Be interesting to know what the mash bill is, because I don't think it's that rye heavy.
Yeah,
the previous batch, I don't know this one, but it'll be similar, was 51% rye. So to be legally called a bourbon has to be 51% corn. To be legally called a rye in the States is 51% rye. So that's why it's a rye. It's 35% corn and 14% barley, malted barley.
Yeah, for me, the old Fitzgerald was spicier than this and had more rye forward notes than this does as a straight rye or as a rye whiskey.
Yeah, which is really interesting, because I imagine you'd think that a wheated would soften it, but sometimes like a wheat will actually elevate some of the other notes in it. I mean, like you think about Maker's Mark. Maker's Mark is just corn and wheat and I think some barley and other stuff. And there's no rye in it at all, which makes it this saccharine sweet, because that wheat is elevating the corn component. So it makes you wonder if it's like, there's still definitely some like rye in Old Fitzgerald, but it's more heavily wheat oriented. So it makes you wonder if that's still picking up a lot of that rice spice in the process. It's It's really interesting. I like to think of it as like in gin production, but in gin production, different botanicals can affect the flavor of other botanicals. So if you're using this and that, but then you add in lemon myrtle, suddenly it can change the way that those two botanicals taste and behave and make it something revolting, which is really interesting. A friend of mine did a study test and it was just like, whatever you added made it taste like oysters, take it out, please, make it go away. I was like, it's not how a ginger tastes. And it was just one random botanical that changed everything. So yeah, that's super interesting.
Very cool mint on the nose.
Yeah.
It's kind of lacking almost any spice. It's more like a cool mint bourbon.
I'm getting a bit of baking spice with like a crust of caramelized sugar on top.
Like a pimento berry allspice.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's what is it? It's almost a like. It's not cardamom, but this like a nutmeg, like a really green nutmeg.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There's something in those sort of Christmas style spices there, but it's just it's not being accentuated.
Yeah, 100%. Well, and I
need like a dulled down, less funky version of seagrass.
yeah.
No, that's
Definitely, I think the seagrass, the apricot brandy carries it though. That like stone fruit sweetness carries the I don't know, carries the rest of it. Seagrass is so good. Anyway, talking about Elijah Craig. But actually, I'm really interested to see what you guys think of comparing the Elijah Craig Rye to the Pikesville. So I think we'll try the Pikesville now. I'm also very conscious of the fact that talking about the amazingly, oh shit, that was a lot more whiskey than I thought. Where was the dropper? The dropper didn't work. Ended up with a full glass. Oh no. Ben will be getting a call from me in the warehouse. But yeah, I'm really curious to kind of see, everything's falling apart, how you guys find the Pikesville versus the Elijah Craig Rye. I think Pikesville is probably one of a very old school, particularly bartender favorite rye. So like comparing them side by side could be quite good. So this is one of the 2 dedicated rye only brands that they make at Heaven Hill, alongside Rittenhouse, which is another bartender favorite. If you live in Melbourne, there's perpetually a bottle at Gin Palace because it was the old bar manager's favorite whiskey. The brand Pikesville was originally one of the oldest in the neighboring state of Maryland. So Maryland was very famous for their rye whiskey. They had a lot of rye farms, rye growers and whatnot. And Maryland, along with states like Virginia and New York, were some of the early landing places for the Pilgrims, the Quakers, the can't remember the name of all of the religious sects who essentially fled England because they were like, this isn't holy enough for us. We need to leave and go elsewhere. So they went to America. It was really interesting. But yeah, like the Mayflower and whatnot, and all that. But yeah, so Rittenhouse was a Maryland brand. It was in production from the 1890s. They closed during Prohibition, and then when they reopened, they struggled. They just couldn't find the same demand that they'd had before Prohibition shut them down. So the brand and the existing rye stocks were sold to Heaven Hill, and with the purchase of the brand and the stocks came enough rye whiskey to last them for 12 years of releasing Pikesville Rye without producing a single drop more. So like these guys were sitting on a heap of rye whiskey, but it just wasn't moving for some reason. So coming into the Heaven Hill brand and family, they had, you know, the backing to push it further, and they had like the brand name of Heaven Hill to really help move the brand. But yeah, from in the early 2000s, Heaven Hill made rye whiskey one day out of the year in order to maintain their stocks of Pikesville. Obviously now they produce it a little bit more often, but it's crazy to kind of see how sharply the downturn in rye whiskey took after Prohibition, but also when Pikesville was sold to Heaven Hill, apparently the former owners kind of said they were like, we're happy because we know that the Shapiras will honor the brand and they will, you know, do right by the brand and understand it, and, you know, make it good and profitable and whatnot. So yeah, it's kind of really interesting story, but they still make it in a traditional Maryland style of rye. I believe they do still source some rye grains from Maryland, but it is produced at the Heaven Hill Distillery in Kentucky now.
Same mash bill as the Elijah Craig, so it's rye 51%, corn 35%, and malted barley 14%. 55%, so 110 proof. The big factor though, and if you look at the label, it doesn't say it on the front. It's actually hidden on the back here. Where's my camera? But it says this whiskey is aged at least 6 years. So compare it to, you know, Sazerac Rye, which Buffalo Trace made there. That's 4 years, for example, even though it's a non-age statement. So the fact that they put that minimum 6 years promise on it and sometimes contains, you know, older stock in it, I think just talk to the quality of this product.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an interesting day when Sazerac changed from 6-year-old to no age statement. I know a lot of people like, but why? And they're like, we don't have enough. Yeah.
I think the Pikesville's a lot spicier compared to the Elijah Craig. Elijah Craig, I get the nutmeg on it. It's more like a fruit loaf, kind of like reminded me of the Compass Box hedonism. The Pikesville's got a longer, oilier kind of texture to it and a longer finish.
Yeah, it's definitely like, it feels fattier and like fattier and oilier at the same time. It's got a lot of it's more like gingerbread, but like almost European gingerbread where the ginger is spicy, rather than the American gingerbread where it's a little bit sweeter. It hits
Yeah, yeah.
it hits a lot harder and a lot
Yeah,
more
there's
different.
that 8% of ABV is very, very noticeable there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
big I actually thought before Oliver said the mash bill, it had more rye in it. But yeah, totally, you get a gingerbread back in the UK. It's like very, very dark and spicier. That's what it reminds me of.
Yeah, that just like that tarry kind of molasses with like almost fresh ginger as well as dried. Yeah, it's one of those, sometimes you get those like American whiskeys and you're like, my tongue feels like it's been sandpapered from the rye spice. That's definitely definitely a lot spicier. So this is probably the kind of whiskey that people would have picklebacks with. Yeah, the more rye spice, the better. But yeah, super interesting. I'm curious to see of the people, particularly who have their cameras on, would you prefer the Elijah Craig Rye? Or
They're just two very different products.
very different products?
It's like, I'm not sure if you'd put that Elijah Craig Rye up against this, or even up against something like a High West, Sazerac, or anything like that, because they feel like very different products.
Well, I would, if I wanted a rye, I would probably go the Pikesville, but the Elijah Craig probably tickles me just a little bit more.
Every day, kind of.
Yeah. That's the kind of rye that I could drink on the regular, as opposed to, you know what, today I feel like a rye.
Yeah.
It's definitely got
And
a
I'm
cocktail style to it, I think, rather than it's maybe not a drinking straight kind of thing, that Pikesville.
Where I'm the opposite, I drink the Pikesville straight every day and mix the Elijah Craig in a cocktail.
yeah, I would agree to that one. But I think like the Pikesville might be like a winter drink, like a peaty drink back home, and the Elijah Craig might be a more spring, summer kind of
Yeah, cool.
enjoyable.
Yeah, I definitely feel like the Pikesville would hold up with like ginger beer on a hot summer's day. But then also would go really well in, you know, like a cocktail, even like a penicillin variation for winter.
I think if you gave somebody the Elijah Craig rye as their first rye, you would ruin them.
Yeah.
They would be in for a rude shock when they next had a rye.
100%. I will say it's really interesting as well. State by state, you can almost taste the difference between different states' ryes. So I've never particularly been a fan of Kentucky rye. Elijah Craig is one of the exceptions to that rule. I've always preferred ryes from Virginia. There's not a lot of them, but Virginia rye is my personal favorite because it is a much softer, sweeter. There's one called Catoctin Creek. I think someone's importing it again. No one was importing it for a very long time, and I was devastated. Yeah, they do their Roundstone rye 100%, and it's friggin' incredible. But it's all that pink marshmallow that you don't expect. New Riff is another one that is really, really amazing. But yeah, you can tell that New Riff is still a Kentucky style rye, and I think that like having a Kentucky style and a Maryland style, you really can like tell the difference as well between them.
Catoctin Creek, is that the Roundstone rye?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've had that one, and I really enjoyed that. That was one of my first ryes I had.
Yeah, one of my absolute favorites. I found a bottle of it in a absolute middle of nowhere bottle wine shop in rural Victoria, and I was like, I'm taking it, it's mine. I turned around to my husband, I'm like, I'm buying this and you can't stop me. But yeah, no, it's absolutely amazing stuff. But yeah, it is just so interesting to see the differences as well, and like that 100% rye is softer than this one, which has that lower rye mash bill comparison, like a traditional rye mash bill, right, Ollie?
Yes. Didn't George Washington have a rye?
Yes, George
Was it
Washington
it was
did.
Virginia as well, right?
Yes, so he was born in Virginia. I don't know if he lived there his whole life.
Yeah, his
I should
distilleries
know.
in
I share a birthday with him.
Virginia.
I remember because they had leftover rye in the fields and they turned it into whiskey, obviously. So, as you do back then when you're cashed up and you've got leftover grains.
Yeah.
I was going to say, so the Elijah Craig is 700 mils. It retails for $95 Aussie, which is great. The Pikesville, because they're just too lazy to change the bottling run, it's 750 mils. So you get that extra 50 mil bonus, which is great with some of these American spirits. It's $150 retail. So yeah, just there's a bit of a price difference there as well. Not just ABV, but I think it's worth it on the right occasion.
Is that US or Australian dollars?
Aussies. I only quote Aussie prices.
Just double checking.
We didn't even get an update on the inflation of a 1934 $25, Ollie. Where's that? Chop.
It was like $600-700.
$700. Yeah, gosh, $700 for fixing a steak. Hell no. That's a staff member back then. But yeah, Chris saying get a bit of bubblegum. I totally do like that Hubba Bubba bright pink bubblegum kind of thing to it as well, but only on the palate, not so much on the nose, especially now that my glass is empty. It's like very, very like pickly. But yeah. All right. we'll move on to the last whiskey of tonight. Let's see if this one's, yeah, it's got the childproof cap, so I don't absolutely flub it everywhere. But yeah, so this is part of a yearly release that they do. So they release 3 barrel proofs a year, A, B, and C. Very convenient to remember. And the number that follows them is the code of the month and the year it's released in. So this is C922. It's the 3rd release of the year in September 2022. So, which is pretty cute and convenient. It's not a barrel number as I initially thought until Scott corrected me. But yeah, it's a really clever way to easily sort the batches without having to go the Abelard route of what ABV is your batch? What ABV is this batch? And yeah, compare them by that. Hey, it works for Abelard, so you know.
But how can that be American if they haven't put month and then day?
I know, right? Yeah, they didn't do month then day then year because, which is it kills me. It kills me so bad the way that they do that. It just
Clearly the barrel warehouse manager worked at NASA or something beforehand.
yeah.
See, Elijah Craig in America, do they pronounce it Craig or Craig?
Craig,
Craig, yeah.
I believe.
I've got a friend, Craig, but when we were in the States, everybody called him Craig.
Craig. I don't know. The way Americans pronounce names is awful. It's like we say Megan, but then Americans say Megan, which either or, I don't know. It's yeah, it's just one of those pronunciation things. But no, this is not a time to make a joke about poor American education systems. But
Emma, I was just reading, so the earlier 2 batches of that year, so A122 and B522 were both bottled at 121 proof. This one's bottled at 124.8. So divide that by 2, you get your ABV, so 62.4. So I don't have an explanation why the other 2 were bottled exactly at the same proof and this one slightly higher, but I'm not complaining.
Yeah,
Would you
100%.
say this is unusually high for American bottling?
The ABV?
Yes.
Yeah, particularly at the age. So Scott suspects that and that we believe that this is the last release of the Elijah Craig barrel proof that is of a 12-year age statement. So all the releases after this one were around the 8 to 9 year mark, but before the end of 2022, they were guaranteed 12-year age statement minimums. So this is the last one that is 12. So for it to be 12 years old and hit 62.4% still is pretty impressive. Clearly in a very hot corner of the warehouse.
I just shared the official mash bill, so it's 78% corn, 12% malted barley, 10% rye.
I agree, Ollie. This is what the 18 needs to be. It's got to be barrel proof.
This slaps so hard, it's so good.
This is this much better than a couple of the other ones.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Mind you, it actually belies that ABV, like probably because of what it is. It just tastes like a higher proof, smoother version. It probably doesn't taste like what it is in terms of ABV.
Yeah, so obviously the mash bill predominantly 78% corn, 12% malted barley, 10% rye. In America, if you have over 80% corn in a mash bill, you can call it a corn whiskey. Nobody really does because corn whiskey doesn't have the name brand that bourbon does. But this is like almost on the edge of a corn whiskey. I'm trying to think of other actual corn whiskeys, and the only thing that's coming to mind is, what is that? Mellow yellow corn.
Mellow corn, which is literally from the same. Well, it's under Heaven Hill.
Balcones.
Balcones True Blue.
Yeah,
True Blue Balcones. Yeah, that's probably because that's the thing. with the mellow corn, it needs way more age on it, I think. I think corn whiskey benefits from a lot of heavy casking, which I think is where Balcones does it really well. But yeah, it's one of those things. Like you can, yeah, corn whiskeys can be absolutely phenomenal, but they just need to be treated a little bit differently than a bourbon. And I think the rye holds this one up super well.
So mellow corn is another Heaven Hill product.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Yep.
so
Does it come into Australia?
I've seen
I-
people randomly pick it up. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's super dirt cheap. First of all, so you can pick it up widely available in the States. There's no bottle queues lining up for it or anything like that. So
People aren't lining up around the block for it.
there's a few bottle shops too. It will stock it. I don't think it's officially brought in, or it's not on their immediate radar. It's entry level, like super entry level.
Yeah. I think there's a couple. I think Yellow Rose might do one as well. I'm not certain. Yeah, there's a lot of those entry level. And like I was saying before, corn gives a really high yield. It's really cheap and really easy to get a lot of alcohol out of corn, and it's particularly cheap to grow corn. Back in the early days, around the late 1800s, early 1900s, or towards the mid 1900s, the American government was paying people to grow corn. They wanted to build an entire industry on this because it was they wanted to make it as cheap as possible, which is why everything in America is sweetened with corn syrup, because corn is one of the number one products that they have. It is also lends to why so much of it is used in whiskey production. But corn is one of the biggest products grown in America because they put it in goddamn everything. They'll put it in bread as well, which is why I can't ever go to Subway. But
there's some very interesting stories slash, suspicious things around why there is so much corn in the American diet. But yes.
Ooh, all right.
Just googling it. So this is one of the higher rated corn whiskies on Whiskey Base. Obviously, a single barrel. They used heirloom corn, a type that was originally extinct for 100 years or something. They've re-imported the corn from Mexico. They're obviously similar to Balcones, playing with blue corns and some of the others. So yeah, that's where the red color comes from. It's just naturally distilled from the corn.
Yeah, it's interesting to note as well, like particularly the Americas, they grow a lot of corn that a lot of people don't realize. Maize as well is, like, obviously it is corn, but it's also not corn at the same time. It's a kind of different thing. Be a red corn, blue corn, purple corn is another one as well. And a lot of these were like widespread varieties at the time during when America was not colonized. So Native Indians, American Indians, grew a lot of these types of corns, and the yellow corn became the dominant one because it was sweeter, higher in sugar content and whatnot, which is why they genetically modified it to grow predominantly yellow, and to be sweeter and juicier and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, the words high fructose corn syrup are probably the most common words you'll see on a food label of anything in America. So yeah, super not healthy.
Whippersnapper Distilleries took out world's best corn whiskey last year with its upshot red corn. So
Yeah.
in one.
Yeah, the red corn was phenomenal. Yeah, Jimmy and the guys at Whippersnapper are experimenting with a lot of corn types. Scott and I went there when we were in Perth, and yeah, they showed us all the different corn varieties that they've sourced from America, from predominantly different growers in Australia, and essentially tried to see what corn varieties they can grow here in Australia to make whiskey out of, which is super duper cool. They have blue corn as well. I think they've got green corn as well, from what I remember. I don't know. it ended up being a very long day with a lot of whiskey consumption. But yeah, super, super cool to see the variation and the differences. But
Shall I launch the poll?
yes, you should launch the poll. I've forgotten you even put the poll together. But yes, I'm super curious to see what you guys pick. And if anyone has gone back and compared the problem is, can you really go back and compare the barrel proof to the 18 now after we've tasted the barrel proof? It's just like, well, it just stunned me.
Blend them together and the heat on the barrel proof becomes a lot more smoother. I think it becomes a better dram.
Ollie DIYing his own whiskey.
I throw in a bonus question there tonight, just for Emma's sake.
Bonus question tonight: marshmallow pickles.
Is this going to be a challenge at the next show, Ollie? Or
What a challenge to
that?
see who can bring me the most marshmallow whiskeys.
oh no, I was just going to bring you like marshmallows and pickle juice, but yeah, okay.
Don't worry, I'm the marshmallow queen. There's a USA food store near my house, and so I get the jumbo marshmallows to take camping, and I make s'mores. And my nephews hate it because they don't like the sticky fingers, but I sit there and eat it. So.
They lasted for something like 4 years in our cupboard, and it probably should not last that long.
Yeah. What's that? We also take a lot of spam camping as well, you know. So spam is one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, just leave it in there for like 20 years. It's still good to eat. Why not?
With the amount of sugar in it, you technically should be able to ferment and distill marshmallows, so you could probably get yourself a marshmallow whiskey.
You can technically, I think you can technically ferment marshmallows. It's apparently very tricky though. So it's like some things will ferment really well, but some of them have different ingredients. So for example, bananas, if you wanted to ferment bananas, you have to add what's called, because it's got a lot of pectin in it, which makes it gelatinous, and that messes up the fermentation process. You have to add what's called pectinase in order to eat the pectin so that the rest of the banana can ferment properly. It's wild. I don't even want to think about fermentation because it's such a really delicate, fascinating process. A friend of mine is writing a book, second book, all on fermentation, particularly for cocktails. But yeah, fermentation of non-traditional grains is definitely a lot trickier and non-traditional items. So you probably could 100% ferment marshmallows and make like a marshmallow vodka, sake, some kind of
just do the
thing.
whole Skittle vodka version at that point, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you could definitely melt them in, but I don't think the flavor kind of blends in the same way. And it's like adding a bunch of water to vodka, like it can disrupt the flavor compounds a little bit and take a while to settle back in. So yeah, I don't know. All right.
Should we share the results?
I think we shall. I think it surprises nobody. The barrel proof by and far, but the old Fitzgerald, coming close on its heels, which is very, very exciting. The Elijah Craig 18 got no love, same as the Heaven Hill, but that's all right. It's one of those hard things where it's like once you've tasted that higher ABV or once you've tasted that, that bigger rye oomph or the bigger spice, it kind of pushes it out. But marshmallow won, yes. Marshmallow whiskeys are the pick, only just though, but still.
These tastings are terrible at corrupting you. Like you'd go into a bar and you've never had these whiskies before. You try the Heaven Hill barrel and bond, and you'd be like, "That's amazing," same as the 18-year-old. And then yeah, we come along and give you this lineup tonight, and an 18-year-old bourbon should hold its own. And unfortunately, we corrupt you with these tastings in a great way.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's one of those things that's a very exciting thing about American whiskey is that older isn't always better, which is great for everybody's wallet. Like, but yeah, the Elijah Craig 18 is amazing. It's just in this lineup, it just can't stand up to its siblings, as it were. So yeah, amazing results. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming along tonight and having like a small little group. We can chat a little bit more. This is nice. When it's just me and Ollie, I'm always like, I feel like I have to fill every space with talking, and it's nice to actually be able to interact and engage with you guys in these smaller groups. So thank you for popping along tonight. I know we ran quite a bit over, but the story is very long, and if you want to read a little bit more about it, it's up on the website, and we'll be sharing the full breakdown of like the full video of that distillery fire in action with the historical news footage of it happening in real time. Just why not, for fun. Michael has also shared an image of the guy who makes that wood hat bourbon, and yes, I fully agree. That man is the most Amish looking man I've ever seen in my life. And yeah, he should be putting his face on every single bottle.
With a real wood hat.
I know, a real wood hat. That could not be comfortable or very water like, I don't know. It'd funnel down into the back of your shirt, like it wouldn't work. But yeah, anyway, I think unless Ollie has anything to add about bottles, or if we've got anything, that's all from me. So thank you so much for coming along. If there's anything else, Ollie, that you want to add?
All the old fits are gone. I think we might have some of the others available. I did have some of the Elijah Craig barrel proof 2 days ago, but it did sell again. So if there's something in particular you're looking for, just drop us an email, Oliver or Emma at thewhiskeylist.com.au, and we'll do our best to try and find you it.
Question, considering I'm actually going to be at Heavens Hill in August, what would you recommend picking up that can be picked up without mortgaging both of my kidneys?
The old
Both of your
Fitzgerald.
kidneys.
Because there is obviously some smaller package releases that they apparently did, but I don't know what the relative price of those are. The Heritage Collection and the Parker Heritage Collection and stuff like that. I don't know what range they're in.
Chris would know that specific question. He was there a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago now as well. So reach out to him. He'll give you sort of the best advice from me. I'd be getting as much shoulder Fitzgerald as you can, just because it's the I think the better value pappy out there.
Cool.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well,
Thanks all. We'll see you at the next tasting.
yeah. We'll hopefully catch you soon. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Yeah, cheers, thanks.
That wood hat is wild.